I'm super excited to introduce our guest today, Ize Idemudia. She is the Chief Operating Officer of International Legal and Global Investment Management at Morgan Stanley. She's also the chair of the Morgan Stanley African Caribbean Business Alliance. Ize was recently recognized on the Power List 2021 in the top 30 executives in finance, law, and tech. So Ize, before we delve into the discussion, please can you just give us a brief introduction into your career?
Sure, Joy, thank you very much for that warm introduction. I feel almost a bit blushy and embarrassed, but it sounds so amazing on paper that I'm going to own up to it in the spirit of finding your voice. I'm going to embrace it. So a brief introduction. When I kind of set off and decided what to study at university, I really didn't know where I would end up. And the role that Joy has just introduced to you is one that I hadn't even imagined in my future. So I, went to law school more because, my background is Nigerian, and as a Nigerian daughter, I had three options. It was medicine, accounting, or law. I'm not very good with blood. I'm terrible with numbers, and so I love reading, and I thought law would be a fantastic option. Following my law degree, I actually interned at a law firm. It was a Magic Circle law firm. And the experience I had effectively told me that I did not want to end up working at a law firm. So I took a very non-traditional route to where I am. And I think the key reason why the experience didn't really resonate with me was because when I looked around, I didn't see anyone who looked like me as a role model in positions of influence. And therefore, I didn't really feel like there was a future within the law firm at the time. I do often wonder whether that would have been a different experience if I'd done it now, because what I've seen in law firms is, a lot of focus on representation and diversity, but back then I didn't really see it. And I also knew that I didn't want to be a junior associate on, back on call every weekend and all hours of the day. So fast forward, I did know, however, that I wanted to work in a, kind of global organization, a multinational organization, and an organization where there was just like a diversity of intellect, backgrounds, experiences, cultures. And I completely fell into banking. I started off using my legal experience working in the legal department of a huge bank. So Goldman Sachs was my starting point, and I spent 10 years there, both in New York and in London, in a variety of legal and compliance roles. So compliance was emerging at the time. Having a legal background was quite beneficial. So analytical skills, your ability to translate rules and regulations and apply it to what the business was doing. And I spent a lot of time in roles where I was asked to come in and fix things. So this is quite, in line with what we'll be discussing later. So I always found myself being brought in to like fix things that were broken. But I quite enjoyed doing it. It was, just the puzzle of it. And I also enjoyed meeting people and finding out a lot about them. So I'm super inquisitive. If we ever have a coffee, I will spend most of that time peppering you with questions about who you are. And so over the course of time, I think I've done so many different roles, but always within the same division. And fast forward to moving to the UK, I moved here with my now husband, and we had two children. And whilst I was on my first maternity leave, I got a call from Morgan Stanley saying, listen, we have a role. It's not a traditional role. It's a bit of everything, but we need someone with your experience. Would you be interested? And my immediate answer was absolutely not. I'm on maternity leave. I've been in this organization for 10 years. I'm not interested in change. In fact, if I can do something with my eyes closed for the next 10 years, I'll be super happy. But then I actually sat down and spoke to my board of directors, who are a mixture of colleagues, friends, family members, and I sought advice. And resoundingly, the answer was, if you have a choice of doing something in comfort or doing something that challenges you, always go for the challenging route. And so with lots of fear, I decided to break free from 10 years at Goldman's, came to Morgan Stanley. and the rest is really history. You know, I think that was probably the first time that I really stepped outside of my comfort zone and started that journey of, you know, really discovering my voice. And that's where I am today.
Thanks, Ize. That was brilliant. Like such a varied career. And as you said, you know, where you've ended up wasn't necessarily what you expected, but it's brilliant just to hear those key milestones. So when we were discussing, like, you know, how would this session go and what would we think useful for the group, Ize and I decided we'd split the session into two parts. So the first part focusing on finding your voice, you know, how did you find your voice? And the second part on Ize's year of saying yes, which I'm very excited to explore more. And as I said, I really hope this is an interactive session so that everyone can take away, you know, things that they want to hear from it. So please do write in the chat box, and I will pause in between the sessions just to, you know, see if other people want to ask questions for Ize. But kicking off with finding your voice, Ize, the first question I want to ask you is, what does finding your voice mean to you?
Great question. So I've actually reflected on this a lot, and I know that we've spoken about it, you know, over the course of the last few years. But I've come down to two things. I think finding your voice is, one, getting comfortable with who you are, so getting comfortable in your own skin, and then the second is how you are confident in bringing yourself and all facets of your life, you know, to the table, whether it's, you know, as a colleague, in my case, as a mother, as a wife, as a daughter, as a sister, as a friend. It's how you project, you know, the person that you're now comfortable being in those different scenarios.
Brilliant. So you're saying it's really about starting within, and, you know, to the audience listening, hearing, you know, finding yourself and feeling confident in yourself, and how do you project that? Okay, so then how do you go about then? Like, now you have said that's what finding your voice means, but okay, like, what does that mean in practice?
Oh gosh, I mean, I'm going to start by kind of holding my hands up and saying that I really, really struggled with finding my voice, and I came to it fairly late in the game, probably for a number of reasons. But one, I would say that, you know, I suffered a lot from imposter syndrome because I always took a non-traditional route. I was always doing things that were never in line with my background or with my experience. So having studied law, I should have gone to, you know, a law firm, you know, I should have done my training contract. Instead, I decided to move to the States and qualify there as an attorney. And not only did I move to the States and qualify as an attorney, I moved to New Orleans in Louisiana, which, if most people are aware, it's a civil law jurisdiction. So everywhere else is a common law jurisdiction. And then when I moved to New York, you know, I didn't go to law school in New York. I, you know, wasn't interested in being at a law firm. I really wanted to be in a global organization. So everything always seemed a little bit non-traditional. And so sitting in the bank, I always remember thinking, looking around, going, gosh, everyone else has, you know, done a traditional route. I haven't. Do I really earn a seat at the table? And what that does is you're constantly in your head thinking about reasons why you don't fit in, as opposed to just being present and doing. And then the second impact is the amount of, you know, kind of emotional and mental energy it takes to be at the table and contribute at the table when you're constantly in your head. You know, you're doing two jobs, you know, effectively at the same time. So I think my journey to finding my voice was probably one of just exhaustion, right? You suddenly realize that you're doing all of this work, thinking and going through reasons why you don't fit in, or why no one's going to listen to you, or, you know, how you sounded when you just said, you know, made that statement, as opposed to just doing. And I realized that I was spending so much energy, you know, in the wrong way. And when I looked around and I saw people just speaking up, just acting, not even giving a second thought to whether or not they belonged at the table, just literally pulling up a chair and speaking up, you know, I tried to think, well, what is the difference between them and me? Like, what is it that they're doing? And I suddenly realized that, they weren't spending all that time in their heads thinking. And, again, second to nature, I approached a lot of, people who I thought were super confident, had, found their voices, had incredible presence. And I asked them, like, what is it you do? What's your preparation routine? Do you go to the loo and kind of repeat affirmations, or do you do your power stance beforehand? And some of them would look at me like, no, I just deliver, or I prepare. And I thought that was amazing. And then some would actually say, yeah, of course I'm worried, but I just get over it and do it. And I thought it's as simple as that. Like, you almost embrace the worry, but you still have to do it, as opposed to allowing that worry to paralyze you. So I think that was probably the starting point to how I found my voice. And I just started, in meetings, I would force myself, right? If I was prepared and if I understood what the meeting was about, I would force myself to speak up in that meeting. So I challenged myself, within the first 5 minutes, you're going to say something. And that was really hard, right? I have something called a nervous gulp when I'm public speaking. And I'm so terrified of it happening that once it does happen, I completely go blank. Like, I can't remember what I was going to say, why I was in the room. And I just had to get over it. And the more you get over it, the more you throw yourself into those situations, the more you practice, the easier it becomes. Not because, your worst case scenario doesn't happen. It's because you've embraced your worst case scenario and you do it in spite of it happening. Does that answer your question, Joy?
No, I think you gave us so many things to unpick there. That was super, super helpful. Like, you first started off talking about imposter syndrome, which is, something that we all hear about, lots of events talking about, do you have imposter syndrome? And a lot of women suffer from it, and then about having two jobs where you're trying to do your job as well as trying to speak up and saying that you have value and you have something to add. And you shared as well, like how you pushed through that. I think personally, from my own perspective, it's definitely been a struggle of, when do you find the confidence to speak up? And it's also interesting looking where you feel most confident to speak versus where you don't. And it's got nothing to do with my capabilities, but also who's in that room. And that's really interesting to think about, like, why is it that some people make me feel less able to speak up than others? And I'm sure there's so much psychology around, being part of the group and either being the only or standing out, which we'll delve into a bit later on. But it'll be interesting for, a show of hands for the people who have their camera on, if that is something they also have struggled with, if they have thought about, is this imposter syndrome? Just a quick show of hands to see. Yes, a few of us. Brilliant. And I think we just got a quick question from Mark, who said, because you took an untraditional route, did the fear come from a concern that people would not understand you, or that you would not be heard?
A little bit. I think my fear was that I hadn't earned my stripes because I didn't go the traditional route. So, one of the wonderful things about imposter syndrome or, confidence issues is that you are feeding, one of two voices. So for anyone who's done coaching, right, there's always the bad dog and the good dog. And the more the bad dog, barks, the more you feed it. And the more you feed it, the more it barks. But you're doing it to the detriment of the good dog. And so for all of the, voices in my head who said, you've got the experience and you're the right person for this role and your perspective is valued, there's also a voice that says, you didn't earn your stripes, and really you stumbled into this room, and the minute people find out, they're going to march you out of here. And so the more I gave that credence, the less I was compelled to kind of sit up straight and speak up and feel like I had something to contribute. And then I would also say that over time, I realized that the very fact that I am in the room means that I have something to contribute. It's not an accident. And, my unique experiences of not having followed that traditional route means that I have a different perspective that the whole room may be missing. And not to speak up in that moment is actually robbing an opportunity for a different perspective to be introduced, and for, kind of a good outcome or a good discussion to take place. And so rather than chastising myself, rather than fearing, contributing something that would be of kind of no value or dismissed, I actually started fearing that I was robbing the discussion of a really key perspective that no one else would have because I took a very different route.
I love that. So you reframed your experience to use it as a plus, and like, how are you different, and how can you use that to, speak up? That's excellent. And something you had said earlier was that, to challenge those voices inside that was saying, like, you don't have something to say that's relevant. You pushed yourself to speak up at the meeting, like you put small challenges to yourself. So to broaden that question a bit more is, I guess, understanding a bit more like how you fought against those demons that, maybe stop you from speaking up, finding your voice. You've already touched on that. Was there anything else that you did?
So I would say that just being confident going into the room is half of it. I think preparation is also key. So I use my Fridays to look ahead to the next week, and I identify kind of key meetings that are coming in, or key initiatives that require my input, and I start thinking about what it is that I bring to the table. And that simple act of being prepared gives you a lot of comfort, right? You can walk into the meeting, and even though you haven't read through the 20 different files that were sent around, you already have a good sense of what is happening. You know what your contribution is, and because you've prepared, you're able to kind of step in and answer questions. Another thing that I would say is, one of the skills that I've always had is pattern reading, except I didn't realize that pattern reading was a skill until I came back from my second maternity leave and went through this like coaching session. But I always thought pattern reading was like, just like a ridiculous thing, like, I don't know, tarot cards. Like, I just thought it wasn't like an actual skill set that you could leverage in a business sense. I just thought it's one of those funny things that I do. And I have the ability to sit in a meeting and like pick up a lot of information and tie them together through patterns. So I can say, I think there's a theme of, or it seems that there's a trend for X. And it wasn't until I realized that that is actually a valuable skill that I now use that as my ability to, contribute to meetings. So even if I've come in and I don't know what the subject matter is, I can still ask a question based on the patterns that I think are emerging from the conversation. And I found time and time again to be that person going, listen, I think there's a theme here. Have we done a read across to there? People sit up and listen and like, where did that come from? And so it's really, again, don't underplay, your skill sets. Feel free to bring yourself into the room, even if the way that you articulate a matter doesn't sound as, polished or coherent as your colleagues. It is still valuable because it is your unique skill set. It's your unique experience that you're bringing to the table. And I'm just going to rewind a bit, actually, because Joy, I don't think I answered your question, which is, how did you start? My starting point was actually thinking about what my gospel truths were. So my gospel truths are skills that I have that I can use no matter what scenario I'm in. So if I'm in a new role, or if I've been thrown into a new project, or if I'm just meeting new people, what are the 3 things that I know I absolutely am good at, regardless of where I am? And I think once you recognize what those skills are, that's your launch pad, no matter what your, kind of new challenges. That's your safety net. And so for me, it's always been pattern reading, the ability to forge relationships. Like, literally, I think I can work with the most difficult people. I think I have worked with some of the most difficult people, but that's just a gift I have. I'm good at relationship building. And then the last one is fixing. Like, I've always been thrown into roles where I'm required to fix things. And so rather than kind of, thinking of it, just taking it for granted, those are my gospel truths. So no matter what new role or challenge or experience or situation I'm in, I think about those as my starting point, and that automatically gives me confidence, and that automatically gives me the strength to, be myself and be very comfortable bringing my full self into that scenario.
Brilliant, Ize. I love that. And it does tie back to, the original question where you said, like, be grounded in yourself, like be grounded in what your skill set is, what you bring to the table. And when you really focus on that and are confident in that, that really gives you that push, to speak up. I also loved how you talked about preparation, because I think that's something that I was told quite early on in my career, and that's helped so much because I would have had like something I want to say already in the meeting. So it's like, I'm going to say this by the end of the meeting. There's obviously been times where, of course, that hasn't come up, or someone said it before you and you're like, why did they say that? Or someone says something that's so basic and everyone's like, great point. And you're like, I could have said something even better. So I definitely think preparation helps a lot with that, because then you're not forced to think on the spot. So I definitely agree with that. I might open it up to the...
That's such a funny point. Like the number of times, I'm sure everyone in this call has literally been like, I'm going to say X, and the person before them says it. But something that I've learned from my male colleagues, which I completely have taken now, is you don't let the moment go. At some point in the conversation, you can still say, you know what, I completely agree with so-and-so, or further to so, or to build on what so-and-so said, I was thinking the same thing, and then you add your own nugget. That's a great way to bring it back to how you inject in a meeting. So just a quick hack for everyone.
Thank you. And yeah, no, I was just going to ask the audience if anyone themselves wants to share, any tips that they put into place for making sure they speak up in a meeting or finding their voice.
Rather than a tip, I had a quick question on something that we'd touched on, of some meetings you may go in and feel super empowered and be able to speak, for example, with senior leaders. But then I have a situation that a similar senior leader, but in a different department, I get a lot more worried and a lot more anxious for no apparent reason. Just tips for dealing with that, just different people of the same level, that you how to be able to deal with that kind of and be able to speak in those situations.
Oh, that's a great question. So I've changed roles about 18 months ago, and I've gone from a role that was quite an insular role, and I dealt with, a subset of the business, a much smaller subset of the business, into a role where I'm literally only dealing with heads of businesses. And, my initial apprehension was, gosh, everyone is so super senior. This is terrifying. How am I going to have impact? I have to tell people what to do. I have to follow up and ask them for information, and I have to hold them to account. And, I think it would be something that my mum always says, which is, at the end of the day, everyone's just human and everyone poops, right? So you almost have to get over the fear of who someone is based on stature, to they are just human and there's a job to be done. And I think from a relationship management standpoint, the more you can get to know people's personal stories, the less intimidating they become. So I really do try and either have coffees or learn a little bit about who it is that I'm about to engage with, so that I just know who I'm dealing with. And again, it takes away a lot of the anxiety. I just realized we're being recorded, so everyone poops is obviously not a technical term. It is something that helps.
Brilliant. I did write that down to remind you that you're being recorded. But I 100% agree with that. I think familiarity, definitely, Sophie. I think if I'm thinking about the people I feel nervous about, it is that because I don't have a personal connection with them. And I know actually you can't build a personal connection with everyone, but if it's someone that you're going to regularly interact with, maybe thinking about having a coffee on the side, and then when you have those meetings with them, it actually becomes a lot easier because you know them personally rather than just in a business sense. Any other questions? Hi, Bernadette.
Hi, this is not a question, it's just an input. I think it's also important to note that once you're in a room with people who are senior, a lot senior than you, it's easy to think that because a question didn't pop up, it's in your head, that it's not valid or it's a stupid question. It's always get that question across, because not everyone can think, about everything at the same time. So it's just an input.
That's such a good point. Because it wasn't said doesn't mean that it's not valid. You'll be so surprised. That's why I said within the first 5 minutes, push yourself to say something. Try not to be in a meeting where you're silent the entire time. I know it's really hard. Obviously, don't talk for the sake of, speaking. But if you have an idea, if you have a thought, if you have a question, do ask it. Because I also find that, questions are the best way of gauging who in the room actually knows what they're talking about. And you'll find that when you ask a question that you may think, actually, no, this is too simple, I can't ask it. A number of people turn around and say, gosh, I'm so glad you said that, because I had no idea what they were talking about. So yeah, I do feel empowered. Now I'm going to be quite forward and actually select a question that I saw from Diana. Hi.
Hi, Ize. Hi, everybody. It's wonderful to listen to you, and that I also had this untraditional path, and it was never really a fear, because I always was just myself, or try to be myself, and being at tables, yes, sometimes it's really terrifying, and the imposter syndrome hits, but I learned it as well. And I think especially with motherhood and with a family, I could overcome that as well. What I still notice nowadays, it's like people really think I bring refreshing ideas and just a very different way of thinking to the table, and they sort of nod and think it's quite funky, and they always come afterwards and say, oh, good point, huh? But collectively, and especially and it's not but it's especially collectively, a couple of men of a certain age, they don't dare to endorse any new or fresh ideas. So it's so I always think, like, is it the way I sort of ask the question? Because I totally agree with you, it's about asking the questions, and a lot of time nobody can answer, but then they say, okay, let's go to this next point. So it's just this sort of funky ideas, they're very welcome, and they come and tap me on the shoulder later on, but collectively they're not straightforward, and they just try to shovel away. Did you have that as well?
I love that. I do have that, and it's something that I really had to get over. So I just have to give a little bit of background. I mean, honestly, everyone, like, Diana is like one of the most fabulous women that I know, that I had the good fortune of meeting when I was a teenager interning at the UN in New York, like many moons ago, and we are still friends. And I encourage everyone to Google Diana, because she is a trailblazer, and I'm absolutely floored that you've joined the session. This is so wonderful. I know. But so, to take your point into context, you're completely right. So in my current role, the majority of my stakeholders are men, and they are men of a similar background and of a similar generation. And what I find really fun, actually, is injecting my own perspective as a woman, as a Black woman, as someone who's younger than they are, and watching. Oftentimes it's followed by silence and oh yeah, we don't believe it. However, what I have realized is that you are planting a seed. And the reason why, as a collective, no one wants to admit it, or no one kind of agrees in the moment, is because they need some time to go and think about what you've just planted. And I will say that 9 times out of 10, the collective have come back individually and said, you know what, that was a good point, or I thought a little bit more about what you said. And for me, that's the key. When they say, I've thought a little bit more about what you've said, it means that you're starting to influence, mindsets and decisions. Personally, 2020 was like a year of reckoning, right? We went through COVID, we went through Black Lives Matter, and a lot of my job was explaining to individuals who had no personal experience, on racism, on, bias, and explaining to them like what it was like. And for me, that was quite tough, but I planted so many seeds and saw those seeds come to fruition. that really convinced me that you don't need people agreeing with you in the room. You need individuals coming up to you afterwards saying, you know what, I thought about it further. And for me, that is job done.
Brilliant. No, thank you, Ize. And before I move on to my next question, did anyone else want to raise a point? Okay.
Thanks, Joy. Just to Ize's last point there, and I think that is so important to, you know, to give feedback, positive feedback for someone, because that may have been such a stressful situation for them to raise that point, or you know, maybe it was that one time that they thought, I'm actually going to say something today. It's so important to give that positive feedback to help people in their journey as well.
Yeah, no, I totally agree, Katie. Interestingly, Lydia, the question you've just sent, one of the questions I wanted to get Ize to explore really was around, which you kind of answered with Diana's question, Ize, was about being the only. As E2W is a female network, a lot of women find themselves in financial services institutions being the only in the room. As a Black woman, that's even more, you know, like even more extreme, because you're the only woman, you're the only Black person in the room. And looking at Lydia's question where she says, where you're in rooms with people that are incredibly different to you, do you think understanding the dynamic of the group is important to you? Or do you think you should always remain authentic with how you present your thoughts and questions? So if you can answer that, as well as, you know, being the only, how you've had that experience. And there are so many benefits as well, you know, that I can share as well, that I think of having, as you said, a different perspective, being comfortable with being uncomfortable, you know, having to be in spaces that weren't made for you and still excel. Like, you know, if you could share a bit about your thoughts around that.
Yeah, of course. So being the only, I mean, from a young age, I think I have always been used to being the only or being one of a few in every scenario. So, you know, I was born in Buffalo, New York, to Nigerian parents who were there, you know, studying for their PhDs. I was raised in Vienna, Austria in the 1980s, so I could really count on one hand how many other kids who looked like me, you know, were in my class. And then when we moved to the UK, I was in, you know, a school in Bath in Somerset. And again, you know, there weren't very many, you know, Nigerians, let alone Black people living in Bath at the time. So I think I've had to grow quite resilient about being the only from a very young age. And to be honest, it isn't something that necessarily bothered me or that I was necessarily aware of until I moved to the States. And in the States, I was definitely more aware of being the only. And I think, you know, this is probably a topic for another day, but kind of race and racial awareness is very, very different in the US than it is in the UK. Although I believe that, you know, the UK is very quickly having to develop a vocabulary around race, because, you know, in British nature, we just don't talk about things that are uncomfortable, whereas now we're really having to grapple with it. But, you know, I suddenly became aware of, you know, gosh, you know, not only am I a Black woman in this room, I'm a Black woman with a British accent in this room. And I think that people treat me very differently in the sense of, to some groups, I'm just a Black woman. To other groups, I'm actually British. So, you know, who cares about my Blackness? And then to other groups, I'm just British and Black, but, you know, I'm not factored into the gender discussion. So, you know, I think the trick is, it's actually less about preparing on your audience. It's more about understanding how your audience is viewing you in that room, and then taking advantage of it. Really, that's your power. That's the power of being only in the room. You know, everyone's going to have a perspective of who you are, what you're going to say, how you're going to say it, how you're going to act. And for every time you debunk that perspective, you've gained power in that room. So for many, many years, I was a negotiator. I used to negotiate contracts. And 10 times out of 10, when the other lawyers will come into the room to negotiate this contract. I would meet them at the lifts. I would take them into the conference room. I would sit them down and I would purposefully ask if they would like some water. And then I'd come back with the water and shut the door and I'd sit down and they would say, where is Mr. Idemudia? I'm like, Miss Idemudia. And they're like, yeah, when is the lawyer coming in? I'm like, that's me. And if you start a negotiation from a point in which that person is super uncomfortable and is really awkward, they're on the back foot. And I would completely use that to my advantage, right? I'm going to play on your awkwardness. But I found that helps in so many other scenarios. Like people may have their complete perspective, they may estimate you, and you come in and you shine. To me, that's what being the only does. It's your power and your edge and your advantage over others in that room because of the unique experience and perspective that you bring.
Love
I think
that,
there was a
Ize.
second.
100.
Go ahead, Joy.
No, I was just going to say I 100% agree. And I think it's about fully embracing being the only in the room if you're the only woman, only minority, etc. And just using that as your superpower, really, if you could think of it like that. And, being like, I have a different perspective, I have a different view, I've experienced life differently. So my thoughts and points to add to the conversation are different. So no, I think you always have to look at it as a positive and not a negative. Before we move on to the next section, I'll just pause and see if there are any other questions for Ize on the Finding Her Voice section or comments that people want to make.
Joy, can I, Ize, thank you. I am often, obviously, the only in the room like I am tonight, and totally agree with your glass of water. When we used to have meetings and get together, I was always the one that was making and pouring the tea and the coffee for everybody, because that was my advantage. People didn't expect me to do that. The other thing I try and do is I look around the room and think, actually, I'm not the only. I share something and look around the room and see who I share something in common with, because that makes me feel comfortable. Do you do that as well?
That's a really good question. I think commonality is key in understanding, getting a sense of who the person is behind, who the personality is behind the person is super helpful. But no, I have to say I don't often think about what we have in common. I don't, but that's a really kind of nice thing to have, though. So perhaps it's something I might build in going forward.
Thank you.
Brilliant. Time is going so quick. Just going to move quickly on to the second section. So personally, I know Ize, and I know last year she started off the year saying she's going to say yes to more things that make her scared and fearful. And having seen that year and gone through that year in a work basis with her, it's been really interesting to see what's happened to her career, what's happened to her profile, what's happened to her brand. So I thought it'd be a really great opportunity for Ize to share what her year of yes was, what it meant, and why she kicked it off. So Ize, over to you on that.
Sure. Year of yes was fascinating. So for anyone who knows me, I am absolutely terrified of public speaking. So doing this kind of a session, I would never have done it prior to last year. I love being in the background. I love doing things behind the scenes. I love setting up, the event and doing the script. But being the person who's actually talking just terrified me. So the nervous gulp, like, it basically prevented me from doing any public speaking. And I realized that in order to get over my fear, I just had to do it more often. So I remember saying to Joy, you know what, for this year, I'm going to say yes to any time someone asks me to speak. If it's presenting, if it's moderating, if it's, opening an event, I am going to say yes. And I had a giggle because we went into lockdown. I'm like, brilliant, I'm not going to have to do it. Lockdown is taking care of it. There are no events, so I don't have to do it. But, we had COVID and the disproportionate effect of COVID on Black, Asian and ethnically diverse colleagues and the network that I chair, we, suddenly realized that actually we're the ones who need to provide some sort of support and comfort to our network. So we immediately started thinking about, okay, well, what does it mean for us? What are our anchors? How do we keep ourselves, anchored in challenging times? And we started pushing a lot of information out there. And then fast forward to May, and George Floyd happened, Black Lives Matter became, kind of a regular part of everyone's vocabulary. And I remember waking up at 3 o'clock in the morning, the Monday after George Floyd was killed, and just, in complete panic, because I was thinking about my children, and I was thinking about what I would do in this moment, right? Enough was enough. What was I going to do? What would I say to my children in 10 years' time that I did to affect change? And I suddenly thought, you chair the Black Network. You have to get front and center. You have to set the tone. You have to speak up about this, no matter how uncomfortable it is. And you have to make sure that in every single part of today, that working day, if people didn't acknowledge it, you were going to bring it into the room. And there was really no looking back. I remember sitting there in my morning management meeting, and the meeting went along, and I said, can we please pause and understand what's happening in the world, and understand that there are colleagues right now who are completely devastated, and how are you going to react to it? And, that meeting escalated into, the departmental management meeting and being asked to talk about it. And I was so emotional about it. I could barely get the words out. I have a son, and one day I'm going to have this conversation with my son. But regardless of how emotional it was, I found myself just forcing myself to get those words out. And then the stage just grew and grew and grew. And, I think that was probably the toughest way of finding my voice, but also the best way of finding my voice. Because if I was able to talk to people about something that was so raw and important to me, and was so, I was going to use the word awkward. It wasn't awkward. It was actually about how I married who I was outside of the organization with who I was in the organization. I figured that if I could speak publicly about that, I could speak publicly about anything. And I did. I literally used my voice. And so anytime I was asked to speak up, whether it was to a colleague, or it was to the CEO of the organization, or it was to the board of the organization, I found, the courage. I got over the concerns and I spoke up. And the more I did it, the more I realized that actually, I think I'm good at it, because I think I'm having impact. I think people are listening. But most importantly, when I walk away from each of these sessions, I feel this sense of like clarity and power and connectivity back to who I am, that I know that I've touched on something that's true. So 2020 for me was like a year of just heartache, but also a year of really recognizing that I had an incredible power and weapon in being able to stand up and tell people exactly how I feel, and how I represented others around me.
Brilliant. So much to take away. And I think, really tying back to that, finding your voice, it's a great example of when you put yourself out there, no matter how scary it is, just speaking up, whether in that meeting or, saying yes to doing a presentation, it offers the opportunity for people to see who you are and what you bring to the table. And I always feel that offers bigger opportunities. So for me, seeing as a bystander of like, you saying yes during that pivotal moment last year to where you are now, like it has had, I would say, a great impact on your career. So maybe sharing a few tips to the audience on, how they can start off pushing themselves, or, any things that, kind of held you back, but how you worked against that. And also sharing how you have seen your career maybe flourish from saying yes more and not being behind the scenes.
Yeah, I mean, number one, I would say, it's your gospel truths, right? Recognize what they are. And then start small, right? No one's saying go out and, speak to 400, person audience. And actually speaking up in, you know, even at a coffee, right? Having a coffee with someone and being able to get across your point can be incredibly daunting. So start practicing your ability to kind of impact and change mindsets through what you say and how you say, you know, within a very small circle. Family members, if you're a part of a book club, you know, speak up at that book club, say what you really felt about the book. You know, if you are, you know, part of a congregation in church, like speaking up in church, like just seek little opportunities to do so. I mean, even things like updates, right? That simple thing of like, you know, giving an update to someone who's really important within your organization or within your network. You know, there's nothing worse than being, you know, coming across someone, they're like, how are you doing? And you're like, oh, I'm fine. And that's it, you go blank. Actually have 3 things, you know, I'm doing great. You know, I'm super interested in this project that I'm working about. And if you want to find out more, you know, I'd be happy to give you an update. Like that is crisp and clear and tells the person that you're really thoughtful about, you know, what you're doing and what you're interested in, and that you have more to tell them. So little things like elevator pitches, and then obviously the more you speak, the more opportunities come to you, as Joy said. I mean, I would never have thought 2020 would go the way it did, but I found myself being pulled into rooms that I would never think I'd be in and being asked for my opinion, right? That validation. And if someone's going to ask you for your opinion, you might as well bring in, you know, inject it with you. You're not going to just regurgitate something that you've heard, you know, read in the news. It's like, what did you think about it? And actually thinking about the language you use. It's like, you know, I think, you know, my perspective is what I really value. Those things kind of signal to your audience that you're bringing yourself, you've really thought about what you're trying to get across, as opposed to just reading reading out a lecture. And then actually the last thing I would say, which Joy, you know, is thanks to you. So for everyone who knows Joy, you know that she's probably the most stylish person that I've ever met. And over the course of last year, I got style advice from Joy. So my style is terrible. In fact, my lockdown outfit has been a blessing, right? I can go back to my elasticated pants and like, you know, t-shirt. But Joy actually, you know, encouraged me to explore my style in a way that was very comfortable to me. So, you know, rather than sitting there and shifting around because you're just like, I cannot wear bodycon dresses, I found a way of actually expressing myself in what I wore. And weirdly, presenting myself when I'm actually comfortable but well put together increased my confidence. And I hate to be the person to say that, because, you know, I don't want to be the woman saying, you know, dress well, women, and everything's going to be fine. It's not about dressing well. It's about reflecting your inner confidence outside, and doing something that is uniquely you. That's your brand, that's your style. And I found that really helped me last year, you know, just in terms of being confident, projecting myself, sitting on a stage and not wondering whether I fit in, but wondering about what I was going to say next and how I was going to deliver that with impact.
Brilliant. Thank you, Ize. I don't want to take up time, so I'm going to open up for any questions people might have for Ize. If not, I can continue. Lindsay, I see your hand up.
Hi, thank you both so much. Just hopefully a quick question, and it kind of goes back to your former part. You've spoken of finding your voice, and you found it because something within you changed. And do you think that that's also partly because corporate culture has changed? Because when I started off law some time back now, I got that sense that people didn't want you to bring yourself. But over the past few years, I get a kind of sense of that changing. Is that something which you recognise or have seen?
That's a great question. You know, honestly, not consciously. I think mine was more due to age. And, you know, there's something about when you get past 40, you really start thinking about where you are spending your energy and how you view yourself. And I got to a point where I was like, you know what, I want to spend less time worrying about what others think and worrying and feeding the bad dog. And I want to spend more time actually building myself up and cheering myself on. Like I love mentoring. I love building others up. And I love you know, kind of giving advice and feedback. You know, upon reflection, I didn't do a lot of that for myself. So for me, it was more about reaching a certain age where, you know, I had no more F's to give. I'm going to try and keep it classy here, everyone. But, you know, you just get to a point where you're like, I can't worry about what everyone else thinks. And I just need to be very, very kind to myself and build myself up. But I'm not going to dismiss what you said. Corporate culture has definitely changed. I mean, you know, if it wasn't already changing beforehand, 2020 definitely was a pivotal moment and a reckoning. There is different vocabulary that's been injected into every single corporate culture, you know, thanks to social media. Like, there isn't a single company, including, you know, where you do your groceries, to, you know, where, you know, the company that provides band-aids that isn't kind of committing to inclusion and diversity. Like, everyone is on that bandwagon, which means that something has shifted, and which means that it makes it much easier for me, you know, to be myself. It means that it's much easier for the head of the World Trade Organization to rock up to a first day at work dressed in, you know, Nigerian wear, proudly, you know, kind of taking up her role. Like, something definitely has shifted. But personally, for me, I think I got to a point where I was just tired of, you know, the negative, and just wanting to spend time doing things that were gratifying to me and that built me up, as opposed to like knock my confidence.
Thanks, Ize. We've got a question from Nolly. Some people are feeling fatigued by the diversity conversation, whether gender, ethnicity, career break, returnees. How are you able to continue the conversation within your circle of influence, but with a fresh approach?
Oh, that is such a great question, Nolly. And you know, the fact that you've asked it, I wonder if you're at that point. So last year for me was also quite exhausting. I really had to go back into a period of reflection and think about what outcomes I cared about and I wanted, and where I could make impact. Because you're at risk of actually spreading yourself thin and trying to engage everyone in a conversation, or even presenting yourself as the go-to person. If, you know, anyone wants to talk to you about, you know, what's the experience of being a Black woman in the corporate world, you know, it's like you've got a sign on your head. And you are actually allowed to establish boundaries. You are allowed to say no. If D&I is not your day job, you know, you don't have a contractual obligation to come into work and take up that mantle. This is something that I realized at the end of the year. So I think it's about, again, starting with you, thinking about what outcome you want and where you're going to have the greatest impact, and focusing your energy in those areas, and then establishing boundaries when others are trying to force you into other areas. How do I continue the conversation within my circle of influence? You know, I try and keep it, you know, I try and keep it relevant, and I also try to plant seeds where I can. And that starts with at home. You know, within my home, I'm in a mixed race marriage. My children are mixed. And actually, one thing I found is that I have to maintain balance, because my children identify with multiple cultures. And everything I say impacts their outlook on the world. And I have to be very careful not to make them feel embarrassed or negative about, you know, parts of their own culture. I have to give credence and respect to them all. So, you know, it's about continuously learning and also challenging myself, right? To think, am I saying the right things? You know, am I furthering, you know, the kind of society that I want to live in, that I want my kids to live in, or are my words and actions actually, you know, not helpful, not helping that? It's a bit long-winded. I hope that answered your question, Nolly.
Hi, Ize. Yeah, thank you. I think you kind of did. What I got from that is you have to pick and choose your battles.
Definitely.
And even if you're the only other, you don't have to always go into the room and address that. And I suppose it's about focusing your attention or energies in those spaces where perhaps you've got a fresh perspective, or you know that the audience is actually receptive to what you're saying.
Yeah, and ones that you actually enjoy. You know, as I said, it's not You know, D&I is not your day job simply because you're a Black woman. It just isn't. You were hired into a role for a particular reason. And, you know, I do want to caution, you know, kind of people on this call to think about it. We are all invested in inclusion, right? Inclusion, the very word of inclusion means that everyone has a part to play in it. So if you are putting undue, you know, weight or expectation on one person to tell you how you can act differently, or, you know, kind of what knowledge you should have, you're missing the whole point of inclusion. Like, we all have a responsibility to go and learn. We all have a responsibility to go and get certain experiences, or to empathize, or to find ways to engage in conversations. It isn't down to just one group of people. And the more we can all take that active stake in the process, I think the faster this process will happen.
No, I agree with that. Thank you. And I'm sure, Mark, you will agree on the gender, from the gender perspective. I mean, you've been doing it for 20 years, so you can probably relate to what I'm saying, where there's that feeling now, sometimes when I hear people speaking who are male, of, you know, mothers meeting, another, you know, what's the next thing? They're not safe anymore on the streets. It's like, you know, people are getting a bit fatigued, and it can be a bit frustrating when you're having those conversations, because can feel like they're missing the point.
Yeah, Nolly, listen, I think when I get like that, I look back and think of actually how far we've come, and the progress we've made, and the fact that we've all now, you know, whatever background we're from, whatever gender we are, wherever, you know, our roots are, you know, there's a finishing line not far away, and we can't give up. We've got to get there, because we're moving towards and in the direction of the world that we all want to live in.
So, conscious that we've reached time. If anyone has a burning question, please put your hand up. But if anybody, perfect. Okay. So just want to thank you so much, Ize, for coming to share your thoughts and wisdom, your career, on how to find your voice, as well as your sharing your year of yes. It's been super excellent to hear your career and just the bits of wisdom that you've given to everyone. I think the thing that resonated the most with me, and hopefully with the rest of the group, is really just, what are your guiding truths, principles? You know, what do you bring to the table? Being grounded in that, focusing on that. And also just being prepared when it comes to meetings, or if you're bumping into someone, to have something to say, so that every interaction that you have is adding value, and that people are getting to know who you are and the various businesses that you're in. So I really appreciate your time. And thank you, everyone, for being so engaging and for all the questions. It's been a pleasure. And as Mark said, for any of the people who are not part of E2W Alpha Challenges, please do email Katie at the email address in the chat, and hope to see you at future sessions.
Thank you all. Thank you so much for having me. I really, really enjoyed this. Thank you.
Joy and Ize, well done. Thank you so much. Brilliant session. Really, really, really wonderful. Ize, you're an inspiration, as you are Joy. So thank you. I really enjoyed that.